To receive our transactions in the transaction list file, in the transaction list widget here, we can first of all add a new final property here, which is a list of transactions. So this doesn't change, which I'll name transactions. Of course, you can use a different name here. So we have that final list of transactions, and that should be set with the help of the constructor now, because the constructor is how you can pass data from the parent widget into a child widget, so into this widget here. For that, I'll use the shortcut and expect to get the transactions as my first and only positional argument. So now incoming transactions are saved here, and instead of underscore user transactions, we again now use just transactions here, referring to this list. Now in user transactions, where I do instantiate the transaction list widget, we now have to pass our list of transactions, and that here simply is underscore user transactions. So thus far, we just did a lot of reorganization without actually getting closer to the point where we can add a new transaction. But this will change now. Now in the user transaction file, where we manage our list of transactions, we can add a new method. A method that doesn't need to return anything and therefore will have a return type of void, and which I will then name add new transaction. The name is up to you, though it should start with an underscore to mark this as part or as private and as part of that private class here. In here, I expect to get two pieces of information. I expect to get my title, which will be a string, and I expect to get my amount, which actually should not be a string, but a double, let's say. So here I get my title and my amount, and I then want to create a new transaction here. So I'll create a new variable, which I'll call new tx maybe. It's final because here I created with the values that are passed into this method. So it is create based on values which I don't know at the point of time I'm writing the code. Hence const can't be used here. But I can use final because once that transaction has been created with these dynamic values, it will not change again. So here I will create a new transaction by using the transaction constructor. And for my title, I pass the title. Now to avoid confusion, I'll name this tx title here. You don't have to rename it. You can use the same argument name here as you expect here. But to avoid confusion on what's what, tx title is what I pass as a value because I get it here as an input to this method, and I pass this as a value for the named title argument on my transaction constructor. For the amount argument, I pass tx amount. Again, you could have named tx title just title and tx amount just amount. That would have been okay. Now we also need to pass an ID and a date. For the moment, we have no way of selecting the date. We have no date picker the user could use. So why don't we again use datetime now to use the current date. And now for the ID, I want to have a value which is kind of generated automatically and unique. And therefore, I'll also use datetime now to string here. It's not perfectly unique. Theoretically, we could add two transactions at the exact same timestamp. But here for this app, it will do for now. And it will be a string, and it is generated automatically, so we can treat this as a kind of unique ID for now. This is the new transaction, and this new transaction should now be added to the user transactions list. For that, since I also want to update the user interface, because build should run again to rebuild our transaction list, and then also rebuild new transaction, that's the side effect. Since I want to update that, I have to call setState now, which I can call because we're inside of a state class, extending state. So we can call setState in here. And inside of that function you pass to setState, I will use my user transactions, which is that property up here. And now I want to add a new transaction. Now, of course, that is marked as final. But remember what I explained earlier when we talked about final and const. I mentioned that Dart stores objects in memory and only stores the pointer at these objects, the address in your variables. So underscore user transactions holds a pointer at this list. The pointer, the address itself, is final. We can't do user transactions equals something. That would not be allowed, because then we would try to assign a new value to user transactions, and user transactions is a final variable. What we can do, however, is we can interact with that list, because that doesn't change the pointer. The object stays the same. We just manipulate the object. And that can be done with the help of add. Add is a method we can call on a list to add a new element to that list. And that will change the existing list, but it will not generate a new pointer or a new address. And therefore, we don't violate this being final. We just added the object that's stored in this final variable. So here I add a value, and that value, of course, is my new transaction. Now, thanks to setState, that should be reflected on the user interface, and a new transaction should be added to our list. To now see that all come together, let's go back to the main Dart file, and there, let's now add our user transactions widget on which we worked below our chart container here. And for that, as always, you need to add an import, which should be /widgets user transaction start. Then that's added here below the container. Now, last but not least, we have to make sure that when a user now presses this button, the add transaction button, we don't just print the text of that transaction, but that we actually trigger that add transaction, that add new transaction function in user transactions. Here's your chance to wire that up on your own. We'll of course do it together in the next lecture.